Now I'd like to invite each of the panelists to come on up here, and you're going to give them a big, rousing welcome. Let's start with Dr. Stephen Luckert. He's the Senior Program Curator for Digital Learning and New Media at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Stephen. Next up is my former colleague at Columbia, my dear friend Emily Bell, who is the founding director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. We're so happy that Yasmin Green can join the conversation. She works at Jigsaw, which is a technology incubator created by Google, and she works on projects that aim to counter violent extremism online. Yasmin Green. Please welcome to the Paley Center for Media one of the great media experts, Rick Stengel. As many of you know, Rick was formerly the managing editor of Time magazine, and since 2014 has served as the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs at the State Department. And the next person has a portfolio you may not know actually exists, but we're delighted to have Monica Bickert here. And Monica is the head of product policy, including counter-terrorism at Facebook. If you're tweeting, please remember the hashtags are fueling extremism and hashtag challenging extremism. So we have both sides completely covered there. So the idea is that we'll have a conversation here and then we'll bring you in. And we're also monitoring the questions online. So if you're on Facebook, please do post comments. I'm going to start by a general question to the panel. Yesterday's debate, and the first of three, and then the vice presidential debate coming, there wasn't really a conversation about extremism, but some of you may have found ways to interpret some of the comments as being about that. What would you have liked to have heard from the two presidential candidates last night and then going forward in the 40-something days we have left? Let's start with Stephen.
Well, I think the seriousness of this problem is something that, for instance, President Obama addressed at his UN speech. It's an issue that, for instance, UNESCO and the UN and various governments around the world are trying to address. So I think that this was something that I thought the candidates perhaps could have spent a little more time on, about what solutions there are, what they're proposing. One of the candidates, didn't want to reveal anything about his plan, but I think some information about how they would confront this issue and how particularly it would affect the United States.
Okay, Emily?
Yeah, speaking as someone who pays taxation, gets no representation, which I guess you're getting your own back. As a bystander in this firmament, I just thought it was interesting when Hillary Clinton said, we're working with. She said she had a variation of we're working with tech companies to sort this out, and I guess that I would agree that with Stephen that really it's going a little bit further than that. Which is, I think, in the media, and I would include Facebook and Google now in the media, yes, a significant amount of, if you like, sort of a lot of this is ours to solve, but actually a lot of it is also sort of goes deeper and elsewhere, and I think sort of seeing it as a whole problem. What would we like to see going forward? I think language, I'm a journalist, I would say this, language really, really counts. And actually the use and fueling of fear, particularly in an election cycle, is historically proven. And so having some kind of acknowledgement of that and an ability to restrain ourselves, both as politicians but also as the press, is something which I think would really benefit not just the debate, but actually how we really sort of engage with the problem in the long term.
Thank you, Emily. Yasmin?
I think from the perspective of an incubator within a technology company, most of our efforts to tackle global security challenges are around access to information. And whether we're looking at something like terrorism or authoritarianism or a whole host of digital attacks, we try to see if there are technology plays that we can help develop that take the strategy of access to information. And the link, I think, with the debate last night was the plea to fact check. Because, as we'll get to discuss later, when you actually speak to the people who've been radicalized, whether it's to the so-called Islamic State or to far-right neo-Nazi groups, and they come back, they tell you that they made a bad decision because they didn't have full information. So I think there's a nice parallel there, but certainly more fact-checking would be good.
Okay, thank you. Rick?
Sree, hi. I want to thank the Paley Center and the Holocaust Museum. This is a fabulous event. And do people know what the Hatch Act is? The Hatch Act prevents federal employees from talking about political candidates in an election. So I'm not going to mention any names, and I don't do hypotheticals. But I'll just give you a little bit of background in terms of that discussion last night. One of the candidates started something called the Center for Strategic Counter-Terrorism Communications, which I lead at the State Department. That was an organization.
We have no idea who you're talking about. 50% chance of being right.
Did I use the pronoun?
No.
Okay, I'll use no pronouns. And while she was secretary, she faced this issue in a way that was kind of revolutionary for government. This was an entity that was created to counteract violent extremist content from a group called Al-Qaeda, because they were so sophisticated in social media, because they had guys who sat on a hillside and spoke into a camera for 45 minutes and then they uploaded it to YouTube. But that entity that she created then began to counteract the violent extremist messaging from ISIL really before anybody had really cottoned to what they were doing. And it was really, it was quite an extraordinary thing. And that organization now has changed, so we'll talk about that later. There was another candidate who, one of the most essential arguments that ISIL uses in recruiting, in its branding and imaging, is that the West is fighting to wipe out Islam, that America is fighting to wipe out Islam. That is something that people absolutely believe. And when someone says that there's a religious test for Muslims coming into America as immigrants or visitors, what that does is that fortifies their argument that the West is against Islam, and it helps their recruiting.
Thank you.
Silence.
Sorry. I would echo both what Stephen said and what Rick said. I think we need more details to understand exactly how the candidates are addressing this very serious issue. And we have seen governments get involved in this before, and there are different ways that governments can be involved in addressing propaganda as a part of addressing extremism. When we talk about what Facebook is doing and what some of the other tech companies are doing to try to help people counter extremism, we often say everybody has a role to play. And part of that could mean the government using its convening power to bring together credible voices who could counter extremism. It might mean tech companies providing training in how to use their services and products, maybe providing some insights into the types of messaging that tend to work on their services. And it might mean community organizations, NGOs, and other civil society actors coming to the table and creating that content in partnership with those who are professionals in creating content. So there's a lot that government can potentially do in this space. It's how they do it, and I think those are the details we need to hear.
Just folks, just a reminder that you have Wi-Fi passwords on this document. So if you're not logged into our Wi-Fi, I hope you will and participate. Let me just ask Rick a question. Yesterday it came up in the discussion of how much you reveal to the other side what the plan is. And Stephen, you also, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that particular question. So from a government point of view, if you're fighting terrorism, how much should you reveal?
Well,
so that's, by the way, the sound of someone watching Facebook while we're here. That's good. It's working. That's Emily's voice catching up with us.
I think the thing that doesn't get discussed, and in some ways the elephant in the room, is that the actual military battle against ISIL is going extremely well. They've lost 50% of the territory they once controlled in Iraq. They've lost 25 to 30% of the territory they controlled in Syria. Fallujah has been taken back. We will take back Mosul and Raqqa, which is their headquarters. There's a 66-nation coalition. I mean, the military campaign is going extremely well. In fact, a lot of people in government believe by the time the president leaves office, the actual physical caliphate will cease to exist. But there's a correlation with the fact that as the physical caliphate goes away, the digital caliphate is expanding. They no longer are telling people to come to the caliphate anymore. The physical caliphate, Muhammad al-Adnani, who was killed right after Ramadan, in his speech before Ramadan, he said, don't come to the caliphate, guys, because basically it doesn't exist. Commit acts of violence where you are. So the challenge now for all of us, and we'll talk more about that later, is it's not the physical caliphate. It's down by 90%, the percentage of foreign fighters. It's how do you combat that digital caliphate, that digital message that has resonance to a certain amount of people around the world.
Steven?
Well, I think that's, Rick brings up a very good point, and this is something that Al-Qaeda, I think, understood, that you didn't need a territory in order to carry out actions. And now all you need is, the technical means to get those messages out, to carry out your either recruiting or propaganda or carry out these violent actions. You don't necessarily need to occupy a physical territory. And I think that's a very real danger today. I think there's also, the danger that they'll become, if one can say it, even more fanatical as their territory disappears, and a call for more and more actions to strike back at the West and other governments supporting the anti-ISIS coalition.
Monica, if I can ask you very specifically, what is the kind of work you're doing, and what is the role of Facebook and other companies in fighting terrorism, this kind of extremism and propaganda?
First, it's really twofold. First, we want to be removing content that supports terrorism from the service. And then second, we want to be empowering people who want to stand up against hatred and extremism on the site. So with regard to the first, removing content, you have to have clear policies that say what you don't allow. And we have a set of standards called our community standards, which since everybody's on Facebook right now, it'll be very easy for you to check later. Just go to our community standards section, and you'll see that we very clearly prohibit dangerous organizations from using the site. And this includes any violent organizations, and certainly would include ISIS. That means that if somebody who's a member of one of these groups, or somebody who wants to create a page in the name of one of these groups, none of that is allowed. We don't allow that presence on Facebook, and we remove it as soon as we come across it. But we also don't allow regular people who are just using the service to say anything that praises or supports these groups or their actions. So in the wake of an attack, if somebody were to post an image from it and say, isn't this great, or this is sort of funny, or mock the victims, we would remove any of that as soon as we see it. So that's the first step, is having those policies. Now, when it comes to removing content, the devil is in the details. I mean, the enforcement is very challenging at companies that are dealing with, we want them to be very dynamic places, right? When you're using social media, you don't want to have to write something and then wait for it to be approved before it can go up on the service. We want to be able to communicate in real time. And for services like Facebook, that means we've got billions of new posts every day. We have billions of new photos every day. We're a community of more than 1.7 billion people. So when you have a service like that, making sure that you're setting up community rules is part of it, but then also making sure that you're finding the content is another part of it. And we do that by first making it easy for people to report content to us. Since you're on Facebook, if you find something that violates our policies, you can report it, whether it's a page, a profile, a photo, a comment on a photo. And when that happens, we review it. We prioritize it for review. We have people who speak languages, dozens of languages around the world, 24/7, reviewing this content and applying our standards that I described to that content and removing it. So that's a big part of it. And maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, but part of what we do is try to talk to experts and make sure that we understand exactly what's going on in that space. But the other thing that we want to do, and again, maybe we'll get into this later too, is empower these credible voices to stand up against extremism. And I've talked to Yasmin, I've talked to Rick in the past about ways that we can make sure we're all playing our role in empowering those voices. And there are a lot of programs we support to do that.
And what is the role of individuals who are watching now on home or here? Are there places where you train folks, or are there online places they can learn to participate? Is there opportunities like that?
Definitely. I mean, one of the great things about social media is it is so easy to create content, and you can reach a broad audience. And so one of the things that we've been doing at Facebook is training civil society groups who are interested in countering extremism. Over the course of the past year, we've trained hundreds. Another thing that we're doing is trying to really research what works in countering extremism on Facebook specifically. That's a tricky thing, as researchers will no doubt say. How do you know when something's actually working? Well, one thing we can do is look at the number of times that somebody interacts with a piece of content, or how likely they are to share that piece of content. So over the course of the past year and a half or so, we have worked with a group called Demos in the UK to research what types of messages against hate and extremism are doing well on Facebook. And we've looked at this in a number of countries around the world, in 6 countries around the world. And then we've published those results online. So if you look for the Demos report on speech against extremism on Facebook, you'll see that there are some tips on exactly how to do this.
Thank you. Yasmin, if you can explain a little bit about Jigsaw and what it does within Google. And then do you think that Google, Twitter, Facebook, all these tech companies anticipated properly what was going to be happening on their platforms?
Yeah, I was having a conversation today where someone asked, isn't it controversial that Jigsaw and Google are inserting themselves in these challenges, like the topic of terrorism? And I said, there's no inserting ourselves. Like, we are part of the conversation. There is this nexus now between everything that's happening geopolitically and technology. And I think that's actually behind the creation of my group, which is Jigsaw. Until several months ago, we were Google Ideas, which was basically Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google for a decade, going around and traveling the world, going to North Korea, to Iraq, to Cuba, and understanding that all of this change around the world has implications for technology, and that these worlds are intersecting. So he wanted to set up a group whose goal it was to think in a proactive way about what technology we can build to serve the users who are having the most difficult time. So that's my group. We are largely product managers and engineers. It's a very technical team. We want to understand challenges around global security, and our output, our goal is to build technologies to help people who are at risk. So that's the plug for Jigsaw.
Talk about the redirect.
So in this area, we have the privilege of having a little bit of space to think about things that we can do proactively, applications of technology. And a year ago, we started to ask ourselves the question, is there a way that we can use online tools to identify the individuals who might have some positive sentiment towards the Islamic State, and reach them with alternative answers to their questions? And it's a little bit of a different perspective to some of the other programs that have been born in this area, because there was a really clear focus on who's our target audience. It's not society changing the mainstream discussions about Islam or Islamism or Islamophobia. This was, let's see if we can reach that slice of ISIS's audience who are vulnerable to its messaging. They're not yet bought their ticket to go to Istanbul and then Raqqa, but they are starting the radicalization path. So really clear notion of our user. And then we decided we should go and speak to those people. So I've directed research trips to a whole host of places, including Iraq, to speak directly to defectors from the Islamic State. So individuals who'd gone, trained as suicide bombers, trained as technical drivers, Night's Watchmen, and then defected and can talk about their both the human experience and the digital experience. One really interesting observation there is that when individuals arrive in the capital of the caliphate, immediately 2 items are confiscated: their passport and their mobile phone. So the symbols of their physical and digital liberty are confiscated immediately. And it's interesting hearing why people went, which is usually some variation of a freedom narrative, which is counterintuitive to us, but went to fight for our rights. And they say, but then I arrived and I wasn't free to move or to speak. And one of the young men that I spoke to told me through a translator, it was like in Tom and Jerry, where Tom swallows the key. And I had that visual image of the big key and then the sinking feeling of how are we going to get out of here. And the main takeaway from that was people are making decisions based on bad, partial information, and therefore there's something we can do as a technology company in terms of access to information. So I spent the last year speaking to individuals, including Western, aspiring ISIS brides who've wanted to go to understand their experience, and then to see if we can distinguish the mainstream who are interested in finding out about ISIS online, which is many of us, and those individuals who are at risk. Then we decided to use targeted advertising, which is basically the way that Google and a lot of the other social media companies make most of their money. Targeted advertising to reach these individuals. So in the research phase, we created thousands of keywords, so terms that people might be searching for or browsing for, that we felt could distinguish between the people who are just our parents who are searching for ISIS and the individuals who are interested. So these are things like looking for ISIS-created media. So it turns out the target audience that we had in mind have a preconception that mainstream media has an anti-Islam agenda. So I asked one girl, a niqabi, fully covered, gloves, only her eyelashes showing, a British woman, first-generation Afghan immigrant, where she first heard about the Islamic State. And she said, and she had tried to go, she was taken out of the airplane. I said, where did you first hear about the Islamic State? And she said, the BBC. And I said, oh, yeah. And she said, yeah, I can't trust anything the BBC says, so whatever they were saying, you think has got to be the opposite. And I thought, wow, okay, so it's not just governments, which we've come to realize are not necessarily the right spokespeople for counter-messaging, but it's not even mainstream media. Anyway, a long list of keywords. For example, ISIS-produced media outlets, supporter slogans. Even in Arabic, there's a term that the US government and a lot of people in the Arab world use, which is Daesh. I don't know if you guys have heard that term before. Looks like most of you have. That's a very disparaging way to describe the Islamic State. It turns out anyone who's sympathetic to the Islamic State will not use that term. They will use al-dawla, which is the state and is the respectful term. So put together our keyword list, design ads that use these keywords and that they don't proselytize the ads. They're not moralistic. The goal of the ads is to say, you have questions about ISIS's religious legitimacy, its military prowess, its governance, effective running of a state. We have answers to those questions. And the third and final part was we directed them to online videos from 116 videos from 85 different creators that answered those questions. So there was nothing that said, ISIS is bad, join the I Hate ISIS campaign. This was, let me tell you how they're governing, because we have citizen journalism from the caliphate. Let me tell you what credible clerics say about their religious legitimacy, etc. So combining all those things, research, ads, and curated video, in an 8-week pilot, we reached 320,000 individuals in Arabic and English, which is great. Okay, we found relevant people and we could get them to click on the ads. The question is, did they care about the videos that we were sending them to? Were these providing answers to questions in a way that was interesting to them? And together they watched over 500,000 minutes of these videos. So to Monica's point about measurement, we didn't measure the delta between people who were going to go to the caliphate and didn't. But what we are measuring is pretty encouraging here in terms of our ability to use targeted advertising to reach the right audience and our ability to curate existing content to inform them. And we're betting on them being better informed and making better decisions.
Thank you. I imagine that there'll be some fear that a government may want to look at those 325,000 people and presume they're guilty of something. So that might be also an aspect of
Can I
this.
say just a word on that? Because I think the beauty of what we have available to us with targeted ads is that you don't actually identify an individual. It's not about identity, it's about intention. So if you're searching for fatwas on jihad, religious rulings about the holy war, all I need to know is I don't care if you're a 14-year-old girl in Manchester or a 60-year-old man in Minnesota. I just need to know that that's what you are searching for because I have the ad to direct you to something relevant, and then I have a playlist on YouTube that tells you what the religious rulings say. So we don't ask because we don't have that.
Okay. Emily,
It's
watching,
metadata.
Yes, that's right.
looking up, seeing Henry Kissinger and the word last night was kind of a shock. But one of the things he said was the media shouldn't cover extremism and give and we've heard versions of that in the current campaign. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, I think that what we've just heard proves that if it was ever an option, it's not an option now. I grew up in the UK in the 70s where the Irish Republican Army, which were classified as an illegal organisation, if a representative of their political wing, Sinn Féin, appeared on the BBC or ITV News, their voices were not allowed to be heard. So you have this slightly absurd position where Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness, incidentally, Martin McGuinness now has a medal from the Queen. It's funny how these things turn out. If they spoke, they would be dubbed over with the voice of an actor or subtitled. So the idea now, when each one of you, as Mark Zuckerberg says, has a television station in your pocket, a broadcast studio in your pocket, the idea that you could not cover something is actually sort of not only really not possible, but also to Monica and Yasmin's point about sort of counter speech, that we need responsible contextualizing, high quality information, which one would hope that journalists, certainly I hope journalists coming out of Columbia, are really there to provide. So this idea that you wouldn't cover an incident where everybody has filmed it. I mean, I was in New Orleans when the bomb went off in Chelsea, and I knew far more about it just from sort of social feeds than I would ever know from, it was way before any official media outlet was on the scene. So if you don't cover things, there is now an ability to create a conspiracy theory, often that doesn't exist. So I just think that we've gone so far past the don't cover. However, I do think that we've just done sort of 3 white papers. We did them very quickly over the summer after Democracy Fund Voice asked us to, saying, can you have a look at the history of the coverage of terrorism? And can you have a look at things that might work in a networked environment and get journalists to sort of pick over and write up these at length? And we have them on the Columbia Journalism Review and the Town Centre websites if you want to go and have a look at them. And actually, one of the things that crops up over and over again is the use of language. So, for instance, a remarkably high number of news organisations don't use the word terrorist. I worked for The Guardian for 20 years, and we had a big debate about, terrorism often is not used as a term because it's quite a contestable term. And if you are an international media outlet, does the word terrorist, what exactly does it mean? There's a particular problem which was highlighted in one of our papers in that because of the way terrorism is legally classified in the States, it almost automatically refers to an external foreign sort of association. So under the Support for Material Terrorism Act, if you are Googling ISIS, if you're, it really sort of targets Muslims. So, there is a great paper that Rafia Zakaria wrote for us exactly on this legal point, saying, domestic terrorism or domestic sort of mass murder if you're a Dylan Roof, there's nothing that sort of targets you in terms of surveillance, sort of legislation, in the same way that, for instance, there would be in the UK. So this idea, first of all, that it shouldn't be covered is a non-starter. Secondly, exactly how the press, the responsible press, can create the right narrative, I think is a really big challenge for journalists. And that was the third thing, really, that we found, which was journalism has to be better. It has to operate at speed, it has to have transparency attached to it, it has to wait for verification, and it can really play a role, or it should be playing a role, in debunking or calming and providing some insight into acts when they occur.
So please check out the Tau Center website and find these reports there. You're mentioning how the folks who were terrorists or considered terrorists in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and now are getting medals from the Queen. We were just talking about it, Rick. Rick had written a book on Nelson Mandela, who was at one point labeled a terrorist by the United States, and so things do change. Rick, if I can ask you a question about U.S. government tactics, what is your relationship with the tech companies, and what are we doing right now?
Thanks, Sree. I think one of the things that I want to start out by saying is that the women to my left and right are actually heroes in the fight against violent extremist content.
Oh, that's good.
The tech companies don't get enough credit for what they're doing, what Facebook is doing, what Google is doing, and Jigsaw. It's really kind of amazing stuff. And I was at the first meeting, or one of the first meetings that we had out in Silicon Valley that was led by Dennis McDonough, the President's Chief of Staff, with the heads of all the tech companies. And the thing that we all realized is that there's a tremendous amount that we have in common. And I don't remember who it was, but someone said, well, this is our ecosystem and we don't want it polluted by this kind of content. I mean, I was in the content business for most of my life. I mean, nobody wants this kind of content. So the tech companies are actually doing more than even they say that they're doing, and I think people should feel like you're part of that whole universe and ecosystem too, and you should feel good about that. I'll try to be brief. I mentioned CSCC in the beginning in talking about what Secretary Clinton started. What is under me is the evolution of CSCC. It's an organization called the Global Engagement Center, which came into being with an executive order from the president a few months ago. But it came from this central insight, which is that government is the worst messenger for the message that we want to get out there. So when this started happening, everybody said, hey man, you got to get in there and start fighting them. And a tweet from the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy is not only not going to prevent a young man from going to Iraq and Syria, it would probably incentivize him.
That's at Stengel, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. So we realized we have to get out of the direct messaging business, and what we want to get into the business of, and as Monica was saying, empowering credible voices who are out there, who have more resonance, who have more meaning, who have more credibility than we do as the US government. So I've been involved in this, not my whole lifetime, but the whole lifetime of ISIS.
Not 30 years of ISIS, as we learned yesterday.
Nobody got that joke when we first made it. But what we realized is that they are not trying to reach us. One of the things that has infuriated me about how this has been covered is, are we winning the information war against ISIS? Wrong question. It's not the US government versus ISIS. It's the entire Islamic world and right-thinking people against ISIS. So is that the case? Are we winning that war? Well, we are. The tide has turned. There's 2 or 3 times more anti-ISIL content than there is pro-ISIL content now. There are all these fabulous organizations that exist that are doing, digital fatwas against ISIL. So that has been the charge that we have gotten as the US government. So it's not our voice anymore, but it's empowering credible voices. And just to last, little bit of teeing up some of the stuff we've done. We're also working with other governments. So we helped create with the Emiratis, the UAE, the Sawab Center, which is in Abu Dhabi, which is a counter-ISIL messaging center that's a partnership between the US and the UAE. It's a fantastic place. We are creating another one in Malaysia, which has started already. We are working with all kinds of other groups to do that. So that is the government level messaging. But at the end of the day, it isn't going to be government messaging. We will have won the digital war when government is out of that business altogether, when regular people have overwhelmed those noxious voices of the extremists.
We have about 15 minutes more up here, and then we're going to come to you, so please get your questions ready. Steve, if I can bring you in to compare, if you will, as a historian who knows everything that transpired in terms of media use by the Third Reich and the Nazis, compare today's technology and its influence with the old school movies and other ways in radio and tools like that. And just today I saw that the AP just bought the old British newsreel archive, Movie Tone, just got bought. So been kind of thinking about that.
Well, it's amazing when you look back at the Nazis and how they used propaganda, because it was very modern. In fact, in our conversation up here, I'm reminded of many things that, whether it's the use of the word freedom, the Nazis used that constantly. We don't identify with the Nazi Party with that. They did it all the time. It's an amorphous phrase. It can mean something different to everybody, but it's a positive phrase. No one's going to support a program anti-freedom. So it has an appeal. The Nazis were sophisticated in taking modern communication strategies. Take a look at this. I mean, if you look at for instance, the swastika, that's a trademark, that's a logo. The Nazis, like ISIS, created a global brand. That they created, an image, whether that's a flag, a symbol that stands for that movement, that becomes indelibly linked to that. Hitler understood the importance of creating a public persona as a political leader. I mean, if you think about it, here was a guy he had just become a German citizen in order to run for president. He had no political experience. He had held no political office. So he crafted an image of himself as a leader of strength, will, and determination. But he also understood that you had to engage not only in a broad, appealing message, but you had to engage in kind of a niche marketing and direct your messages to particular groups, whether that's women, whether that's workers, whether that's Catholics, or various others. That you tailored your message to your audience. Technology was also something that the Nazis understood could reach new audiences. Remember, radio was the internet of its time. Radio could cross boundaries, go into other countries. It was difficult to stop. But the Nazis understood that you could combine it with entertainment. And much of what they produced for radio was entertainment. And they understood that people bought into a message much better if there was some entertainment along with it. Because they understood that if you just ran speech after speech, blatant propaganda, people just turned the radio off. So they understood that, and then they began broadcasting in dozens of languages, all the way to India, to South America, to the United States, and elsewhere. ISIS has issues materials in over 20 languages. That is, they both understood the need to reach out and tailor their messages to different audiences around the world. So the Nazis clearly understood this as something that ISIS understood. So I think any top-notch propagandist understood the importance of harnessing technology to get their messages across.
Sree, can I respond to that? We're seeing that with counter-messaging, not surprisingly. It's also true that the local context really matters. The research I mentioned earlier that we've been doing to understand what types of messaging works against extremism is showing us that what might work in India is different than what might work in the UK or Morocco or Tunisia. So there's a local element to it, and then there's also what is the audience you're trying to reach in terms of this funnel on the way to extremism. Yasmin talked about trying to reach people who have not yet bought their tickets, but they've started down that path. That's a pretty narrow part of the funnel. You can think about moving upwards to a broader part of the funnel where you're trying to reach people that ISIS might try to reach out to, sort of an at-risk demographic, even if they don't even know who ISIS is. And then you can think about trying to reach their indirect influencers, their friends, their teachers, their parents, other people who might have some sway. And then you can also think about the broadest part of the funnel, which is just reaching society at large to raise awareness about these groups, so it's part of the dinner conversation around the country. Defining that target audience and creating messaging that works in terms of the credibility of the speaker, the format, meaning is it a video, is it a photo, is it an article, and the tone, all of those ingredients are important to get right. One of the programs that we've been doing that is designed to capitalize on local knowledge is a program called Peer-to-Peer Challenging Extremism that we are supporting through Adventure Partners. Adventure Partners is the company that runs it. And in fact, the State Department was a critical part of us becoming aware of that program, and that sort of demonstrates how governments can play their role, and private companies and civil society groups can play their roles as well. The program is this. University students sign up for a class for a semester, and it could be marketing students, law students, sociology students, whatever. They learn about countering extremism. They come up with a plan that makes sense, a message that makes sense for whatever target audience they define. And that might be the young people in their city, or it might be something broader than that, but with a local flavor to it. They create online and offline components to that, and they have a small budget that they can test. They learn how to use social media, they get some training, and they run their program. And then at the end of the semester, they submit for a competition the results of their program. Who did they reach? What were the results of engagement? How did it change sentiment? And we judge that, and the State Department's been involved in this very neat competition as well. We judge that, and there are scholarships and travel and funding for the winners of that competition. What's been neat about that program is seeing how different these submissions are. Just to give a couple examples, from the Afghan team, which was a first place winner in this past semester, their program was focused on using the Quran to show why you need to stand up to extremism if you want to be a good Muslim and true to your faith. And it was all about using religious texts. Their target audience was religious students and religious schools in Afghanistan. Then from Finland, about a year ago, we had a school from Turku, and they're seeing an influx of migrants from the Middle East into Finland. And so their platform, their program, was to try to get these migrants to a place where they felt comfortable and felt like they were an accepted part of Finnish society and weren't going to be tempted by extremism. So two totally different ways of tackling this problem, but very localized. If the extremists are going to use localized messaging, you've got to use localized messaging to counter it.
We have a comment from Justin Bilton, who's watching online. He says, I teach a genocide and human rights course, and I'd be interested in using some of your materials in this. So can each of us give us a place to find more information, and I'm sure we'll type that into the feed. And also people here who are taking notes, if you can each give us something that they should look at, and then we'll come to the audience for questions. So, Monica, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Probably a couple things to check out from the Facebook perspective. First of all, the Demos report. So it's DEMOS. And we've published 2 waves of research with them. One was about a year ago, and one was very recent. So the one that was published this past September, I think it was September 7th, is focused on material that challenges extremism in France, UK, Tunisia, Morocco, India, and Indonesia. The other thing would be to check out the Adventure Partners website, which has information about the Peer-to-Peer Challenging Extremism project, and that goes into some of the specific projects that these university students have launched. By the way, these programs have reached tens of millions of people in the brief time. This is a 2-year program, and we've had tens of millions of people that have engaged with this content. So it does have a global reach, even though it's localized, but you can kind of see which programs are running and what some of the winners have done.
Thank you. Rick?
So as a brief preamble to answering the question, do folks know what the lion's share of the content that ISIL produces is, what language it's in?
Arabic.
more than 80% is Arabic. Anyone want to guess what the second largest language is? Russian.
Yeah.
The third largest language at about 6 or 7%, the same as France, and French rather, is English. So we are not the target. We like to, I mean, it's sort of a, we think we're the center of everything. We're not the target audience for ISIL by any means. And so that's my caveat by saying, what can you look at to see what's going on? Because our business is trying to help Arabic language producers create their content, give them greater capacity. So we have the GEC, which I mentioned, the Global Engagement Center. You can go to @GEC. They have Twitter feeds in Arabic and other languages. There's the Sawab Center, which is @Sawab, S-A-W-A-B, which is Arabic for the Right Path. They have a fabulous site. And then I think one of the things that people don't realize is these religious institutions in the Middle East, like Al-Azhar University in Egypt, they have all, with some help from the US government, created these really excellent digital platforms for content, not only anti-ISIL content, but what does it mean to be a Muslim? What is the true Islamic path? And there's more and more of that content that's being created every day.
Thank you. Yasmin?
I would suggest the redirectmethod.org, which is the website that has information about the approach that I mentioned before, the findings.
Redirectmethod.org.
Yes, redirectmethod.org. I mentioned that we ran an 8-week pilot to build on the Undersecretary's point. 80% of those eyeballs were on Arabic language content. So again, that supports this insight that really most of this is happening in Arabic online. In terms of what comes next, that approach is going to be applied to both English, in North America, both violent Islamism and the violent far right by the partner who ran the English language campaign, Moonshot CVE, and there's a partner based in Beirut who ran the Arabic language. So this is something now that the partners in the field can run with.
As I said, towercenter.org, we have 3 reports, 2 of which have made it into papers, the third of which will by the beginning of next week. One is called Hate and Incriminate the US Elections, Social Media and American Muslims. One is called Fear in the Ballot Box, How Political and Media Responses to Terrorism Influence Elections, which is actually very interesting. It looks at Israel, 96, Spain and the United States, 2004, and Mumbai in 2008. And those are all, just again, that awareness of how particularly sort of terror incidents often tie into political cycles, and then how to cover it. And then our third one is called Fanning the Flames. Charlie Beckett, who's head of the Polish sort of Media Policy Centre at the LSE, has written that. And that's about how reporting terrorism in a network world, which takes some of the lessons from, if you like, sort of historically from best practices reporting, and looks at how we might think about modifying them for social media and a network world where the role of the journalist is altered. So say towercenter.org or cjr.org. So we have an ongoing coverage and discussion about this on CJR as well.
And the museum has a number of things that I think people might be interested in. Our Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide put out a publication called Countering Dangerous Speech, which is based on studies done in Kenya and various others about how counter-speech and counter-narrative can diffuse dangerous, potentially violent, or even genocidal situations. And there's a guidebook that goes along with it, and as well as some workbooks so that it can be used in the field by people who are on the ground. Another aspect of what the museum is doing is through our propaganda initiative. So we've been going around the country meeting with students, with student leaders, with teachers, professors, and kind of to work with their audiences to kind of prepare students to become more critical consumers of information. Because often we tend to think about the struggle against extremism is about censorship or shutting things down, but there's a critical role in preparing an audience. because propaganda works because of this crucial interaction between message and audience. If the audience doesn't buy into it, the propaganda doesn't work. And so I think preparing particularly younger audiences, about how to discern the dangerous from the benign, and to really get them to critically examine messages is something the museum is working on right now.
All right. We're going to go to audience reactions and comments. I just want to point out that we have in our audience Brendan Kerner, who at Wired Magazine wrote an article, Why ISIS is Winning the Social Media War. So Brendan, if I could just turn to you. Brendan, would you just, sorry, oh, there you are. I'm just going to give you the mic, have you respond to the conversation, and then we'll take questions. So.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew over here. Yeah. And one thing is I analyzed, hundreds of pieces of ISIS propaganda in the course of writing that article that appeared in April. And one thing I think people should be clear about is what the substance of their propaganda is. Clearly the atrocities, the filmed atrocities, are what make a lot of headlines here in the West, but we should be aware that a lot of what they convey is the image of a functioning and expanding state. And I think that this narrative that they are remaining and expanding is really critical to the identity of ISIS. And I think that any kind of counter-messaging or counter-narratives we construct should undercut that. And I think by analyzing, what ISIS fears, a lot of that comes out in the kind of media they create. One thing they clearly fear is the outflow of refugees, because that disproves the remaining and expanding narrative. So I think that we really need to think about what ISIS fears, and clearly they're trying to make our conversation about refugees being a danger. And this is why in the Paris attacks, they actually put a fake Syrian passport on one of the attackers. They want us to think that these refugees are threats to our security and make our conversation about that, not the fact that all these refugees are coming and risking their lives to come disproves the central narrative that ISIS is trying to push. I think that's a very critical thing for folks to understand. And I encourage folks to actually talk about sources. I think everyone should actually look at ISIS propaganda to understand what they're putting out there. Jihadology.org chronicles a lot of this, or .com, I think.
Jihadology?
Jihadology, yeah. Which is Aaron Zellens out of GW University, George Washington University. And people should look at the kind of narratives and the kind of images they're pushing. A lot of it is showing tax collection, showing the building of sewage plants, trying to convey that this is actually a functioning state. And we need to, I think, focus a lot of our counter-narratives and counter-messaging to disprove that and disprove this remaining and expanding credo that is so important to them.
Thank you, Brendan. And please do look for his story, Why ISIS is Winning This Social Media War. You can find it.
Sree, can I comment on
Yes,
that?
of course.
Yes, because Brendan's a very good point. It's another thing that people don't understand. We estimate that 70 to 80% of all the content they produce is positive, rather than the beheading videos that we are familiar with. Because this idea, and it's not a popular thing to say, the idea of the caliphate to Muslims is an altruistic idea. The Prophet said, we must create this caliphate in which where every good Muslim must live, and that's why they talk about the caliphate existing. So it's a perversion of that vision. But the thing that is dangerous now is that as the physical caliphate goes away, and there's this creation of this digital caliphate, and they're not telling people to come to Iraq and Syria, but to commit acts of violence wherever they are, their branding is changing, and it's become a kind of weaponization of vulnerability. It's whatever grievance you have, whatever hatred you have, you can put the black flag behind it, and that can justify ex post facto whatever you do. So that's why we make a distinction between directed attacks like Paris or Brussels and so-called inspired attacks where people do it on their own. And that's the new kind of danger that we're looking at.
The weaponization of vulnerability.
Yes.
Very, very strong.
Quote me on that.
Yeah. I'll also just, listening to Steve talk about how the Nazis used a branding of the swastika. And as a Hindu, you can imagine thinking about this my whole life. It's been very interesting to read Brendan's quote in one of the lines in his article. The Islamic State's brand has permeated our cultural atmosphere to an outsized degree. They're sort of punching above their weight, if you will, in this. So we have a question here. Please tell us who you are. Thank you.
My name is Hank Hanau. I have two questions. Number one, is this going to be rebroadcast? Can I find this online?
Sure, the answer to that is this is on Facebook Live, and we got the same question on Facebook itself. The video will be archived and available almost as soon as this is over. So you just go to the Paley Center and tell your friends they can watch this after.
Mr. Stengel, you keep using ISIL, everybody else keeps using ISIS. Would you differentiate and tell us why?
May I also add that on 60 Minutes, they had the King of Jordan, and he was using not even Daesh, he was saying Daesh the whole time. I'd never heard Daesh, I'd heard Daesh, ISIL, ISIS. So talk about that.
So I use ISIL because that's what President Obama uses. And and it's the acronym for the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, one of my favorite words. So I don't even exactly know why we use ISIL as opposed to ISIS. But by the way, my boss, the Secretary of State, uses Daesh. Yeah. And as Yasmin said, Daesh is a term of opprobrium for the Islamic State in the Middle East. And so anybody who uses it, it's an actual insult to them. So whenever, for example, we're in the Middle East, we only ever call them Daesh. We never call them ISIS or ISIL.
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, hi. My name is Bob Friedman. This panel has spoken tonight almost exclusively about Islamic extremism and ISIL and ISIS by whatever name they go under. I am a little disappointed that you haven't spent more time on other forms of extremism, both domestic and foreign, such as the far-right ultranationalist parties spreading throughout Europe.
Well, we can touch upon that. I know that that Emily mentioned that there's a whole report about the way in which you're thinking about foreign extremism and kind of domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
But anybody want to bring in the far-right European?
Yeah. I mean, I think that so I think it's a great point, and it's true here. It's definitely true in Europe, you know, where I come from, and the idea, I think that this is where those lines, and I know that sort of Monica's team thinks about this a lot, as do I think sort of journalists who support, you know, First Amendment rights, is that, you know, where you kind of draw the lines on extremism is incredibly difficult. You know, there are very strong speech laws in Germany, for instance, for very good reason, post the Second World War. So kind of one of the big questions, I think, about how certainly sort of, you know, social media platforms operate is exporting a kind of an American version of free speech. And I think that they've worked quite hard against that, but there is certainly a sort of an idea that you can say and you can download and you can read what you like here from right-wing extremism. So our paper on sort of why terrorism, and that term in particular, and the Material Support for Terrorism Act, actually does target Muslims and American Muslims sort of, you know, unfairly, and you have many other kind of, you know, forms of violence and forms of extremism here, which actually get First Amendment protection rights. I'm not saying they should have it taken away. I'm just saying that we don't really properly acknowledge that. And I think your point is a very good one. And how you then, the press has always drawn lines about what's kind of, you know, acceptable or not acceptable. The whole point of being an editor or a publisher is to decide what your brand tolerates, supports, covers, etc. I think it's much harder when you have kind of, you know, large, extensible technology platforms to know exactly how, you know, is lots of far-right commentators have been purged, for instance, from Twitter. If you're a journalist like Milo Yiannopoulos, you know, I don't particularly miss him from Twitter. But there's an argument that says, you know, kind of like, okay, well, is that a curbing of free speech, or is it actually completely right that we don't allow, or that commercial companies don't support a kind of coarsening of discourse, particularly which chills the speech of others? I mean, this is such a difficult grey area to get the lines right in, but I think we have to talk about it because it isn't binary.
Stephen, since you had mentioned an Austrian who was in the, you know, changed the course of history, what is happening in Europe today, especially in places like Austria?
Well, it's quite interesting when you look at, for instance, the extreme right, and you can look at it even in the United States. I mean, there was a recent study that was done out of George Washington University that looked at the growth of Nazi sympathizers, neo-Nazis, and white nationalists on social media. It was kind of an outgrowth of work that was being done on ISIS and others, but they wanted to look at how it's being used, and they noticed that between 2012 and 2016, there was a 600% jump in the activities of these far-right, white nationalists, neo-Nazis on social media. So that they were looking at this as, how they've adopted some of these new technologies to reach out to new audiences. I think they calculated that one group made 22,000 new members, or reached out to 22,000 members using this. And it comes in a climate in Europe and elsewhere where you have the growth of this, of the populist right and the far right. So you have a climate that's conducive to the growth of that. I mean, whether you look at Europe, where you see the growth of a number of these far-right and populist parties, where there's, they're gaining at the expense of some of the mainstream parties. But they also are interacting, it's kind of this, they play upon the fear of Muslims, and they play up the threat that ISIS and extreme radical Islamists represent, which in turn feeds ISIS and the radical Islam thing. So you've got this vicious circle that say, well, this is how they view Muslims, in Europe or in the United States, and so we have to strike back. Or you come to the caliphate, or you carry out actions. So it's a very precarious situation where you have, these extremists using social media to reach out to new audiences.
And maybe I could quickly add, from social media company perspective, our policies don't distinguish between the type of extremism. If you are an organization that has a violent mission or is engaged in documented acts of violence, our policies make clear that you are not allowed on the site, you're a dangerous organization, and people cannot promote your ideology. And then we also have a separate hate speech policy that says you cannot attack people based on a protected characteristic like race, religion, ethnicity. And so that approach is one that makes sense for a global community like ours, where, believe it or not, 4 out of 5 people are outside the United States. So the different groups that you might see that would try to target others through social media for extremist purposes are very global in nature.
We have only a few minutes left. Very short questions and very short answers.
I'll try, but just as a native Arabic speaker, I just have to make a point about this Daesh thing. I completely understand the intention of the administration and of people with good intent to use the word Daesh, but honestly, it's become a point of derision culturally in the Arabic-speaking world, because the acronym it's just an acronym. It's the equivalent of saying ISIS, and in fact, the term the Daesh is the Dawla al-Islamiyya fil Iraq al-Sham, which is ISIS specifically. It calls itself Khilaf al-Islamiyya these days, which is KI, which would be the equivalent of just calling it Islamic State. So it just, to me, speaks to a sort of, it's behind the times conversationally in the Middle East. And I think to me, it's quite telling that the conversation is still stunted at that point. And just beyond that, speaking to Emily's point about journalistic decisions that are made surrounding how we cover terrorism, I'm a journalist at The Guardian. I make these decisions every day. And I was someone who covered the rise of ISIS and terrorist groups. And unfortunately, I think we're giving too much credit to the bigger picture narratives that journalists are engaged in thinking with every day, because I think it's a rarity to be able to take a step back and be able to have these really sort of intellectual conversations. And at the moment, I think I'm surprised to hear that the use of the word terror and terrorism used to be much more sort of contentious, because at the moment it's much more, I can't think of an organization a news organization that doesn't use the word terrorism in almost every...
Al Jazeera does not use the word
Al
terrorism.
Jazeera doesn't, yeah.
And actually, at The Guardian, we used to not use the word terrorism.
We do now.
As well.
Yeah,
So,
we do now,
well,
and we do
there you
with
go.
abandon. I mean, it's just, it's really, it's a rampant word, and I think there's just been a sort of a de-intellectualization of the whole process because it's a knee-jerk instance, and this hysteria has sort of fueled the reaction. I've spoken too long, so I'll give
But thank you. I just make the point that in defense of the State Department that the King of Jordan only uses dash. So just to make that clear. Go ahead.
This question is directed towards Monica at Facebook. Being very involved in Israel advocacy and anti-Semitism, I have seen time and time again posts that are either anti-Semitic in nature and or promoting incitement or martyrdom that have been reported by multiple people and not removed, as well as posts that are showing people with Israeli flags with actually no content in any derogatory fashion, not being removed when they should not be in our estimation. It seems that Facebook outwardly is slanted towards the anti-Semitic. I don't know if I hope that's not the intent, but how will you respond to that? Because it surely feels that way.
And although I, of course, can't address any specific instances, we do have policies, like I said, against anti-Semitic content, just as we do against any other content that attacks people on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity. That means that if somebody targets another person or a group of people based on their faith, we will remove it. As you point out, it has to be reported to us first. We don't have a perfect way of finding that sort of content on the site, but if it's reported to us, we will remove it. Now, do we get it right every time? We don't. We have millions of reports that come into us every day, and when you think about hate speech, I've said this before and we'll say it again, I'm sure, hate speech is our hardest policy to enforce. It's very hard because it's very contextual. It's hard for reviewers to look at a post and know exactly what is meant by a certain word, if it's being used as a slur, and if it's being used as an attack. So we don't always get it right, but we're trying our best.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of more questions, and then we're going to give our speakers a final choice. It's coming. Go ahead. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Only 5 years ago, Osama bin Laden been luckily eliminated from the stage. Unfortunately, the Pakistani doctor who is sitting now paying the price for his helping America in dealing with this. And is there any effort in the part of the media to campaign to release him?
Well, so the question's about the Pakistani doctor who conducted the fake polio inoculation exercise that found Osama bin Laden. I think it was polio. So I don't know. The question was, is there anything update about that, and have we helped him, and what happened to the doctor? I don't know if he's still in Pakistan. Is that right?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay. Anybody here? Anybody in the audience know anything about that story? Okay, we'll look that up. Can you just bring the mic? Yeah, we have a microphone question there, and then one down here.
A question for Ms. Luckert. Within the last few days, there was an issue relating to Facebook about content from Hamas, which was pulled and then reinstated. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
I can't comment on any specific, but we don't allow content to be posted by Hamas. So if there's a Hamas-related page or account, it's something that would be removed.
So the entire, and so Hamas itself is banned from having content.
We would remove that content.
Just a parenthetical note, on May 14th, Friday, NYU Law School is hosting a program on women and cybersecurity.
On May 14th?
I'm sorry.
October
14th.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, last two questions here and here. Go ahead.
My question is for the two tech companies. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of how the enforcement and implementation actually takes place. So when offensive content or extremist content is reported into you, how big is the group of people who make those decisions? Who are those people? Where do they sit? I mean, is it a group of 5? And if you can maybe share specific examples, like for instance, the cartoons, the Danish cartoons come to mind. I was in a newsroom at that time, and we went through multiple iterations of discussions at all editorial levels. How does that happen at places like Google and Facebook?
All right, so let's go with Google and YouTube. Obviously,
Yeah, I'm going to do something really cheeky, which is ask Monica to represent me, because I have the privilege of not having to answer those very difficult decisions because I'm a separate group, not Google or YouTube. But I think a lot of the same dynamics are at play at Facebook. So.
Yeah. I'll keep it short. So we do have a global team. They sit in offices around the world, and they're hired based on our need for language skills. They're trained in all of the policies, but we still do have subject matter specialists. So for instance, self-harm, bullying, hate speech, people who have developed experience over time in reviewing those policies. So when I'm trying to be fast. So when you report something on Facebook, depending on what you report it for, let's say you're using the site in French and you report hate speech, it will come through, it will be seen by a reviewer who speaks French and who has knowledge of our hate speech policies.
Okay.
Taking it a bit, I'm sorry, Betty Cohen, taking it a bit further from the process or decision making to taking something down to at what point do you notify, or what is your relationship to law enforcement authorities? Like, oh, this person's watching quite a bit of this ISIL-created media. At what point do you say, wow, we should let someone know, and what is the process for that?
We have in our terms, we spell out clearly when we may share information with law enforcement, and it's basically in response to valid legal process, which would mean we get a search warrant, our legal team vets that and responds, or if we see that it's necessary to prevent harm. So some sort of imminent threat of harm, we can proactively refer that content to law enforcement, and we do.
All right.
Monica, Monica is a former prosecutor.
But I thought it was kind of funny when Sree asked everybody here to check out Jihadology, because then we would be reporting all of you if we did anything that was, there was too. I think that just highlights why there isn't something, beyond illegal content that's reported to these.
Folks, we'll continue the conversation at the reception, but I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give us a final thought and then lead us into the reception. So, Stephen, let's go to you.
Well, I think any solution to countering violent extremism has to be multiple. That is, there have to be multiple responses, because as there's no single path to radicalization, so there's no single solution that's going to work for everybody. And I think that developing those kind of mechanisms and techniques for reaching out to those diverse audiences, and it might be a combination of, counter-narrative and taking down sites and educating audiences.
So thank you. And that's Stephen Luckert. Let's thank him very much for his. Emily Bell from the Tau Center.
I'm very quickly going to say something very controversial, which because I can run away, which is I agree with Rick. The tech companies are doing a fantastic job. However, we also have to look, I think, at how we design conversation, and we design echo chambers, and we design consumption of matter that we like. That is one of kind of like the ways that Facebook works, is that it shows you more of what you like. This is not something that Facebook planned for. It is something that we know about in the press. When you have a pluralistic press, that's one of the reasons you have it. We don't have a pluralistic press anymore. We have very large platforms. And there is a design fault within that, and that creates and encourages a form of polarization, and we don't know exactly what the dynamics of that are or exactly how to break it. But we do know that it exists, and I think that that is something that we all need to think about, both the press and the platform companies.
Emily Bell, everybody. She's at Emily Bell on Twitter.
Yeah, I probably would just end with a small anecdote from one of the conversations I had when we were trying to research the redirect method, which was with a 13-year-old girl who had tried to join the Islamic State, lived in Birmingham, second generation Pakistani, homeschooled, reads the Quran every day. And I really wanted to find out what could possibly possess a otherwise happy 13-year-old to want to move to Raqqa. And she was describing how, her thought process, and she said that she was looking online and she saw lots of images and she thought that she was going to live in the Islamic Disney world. Which I've never thought that, okay, there's two things together, but that really shocked me. And I think what I understood, and then I said to her, well, what about, beheadings and sex slaves, and what about all that? And she said, I don't look at any of that stuff, just the stuff I like. And I kept probing her, but what about, everything that we see all the time that occupies our space? And she said, no, I didn't look at that stuff. And I think when we look at the case of, Hitler's Nazi movement and his propaganda campaigns, they had a captive audience. You put everybody in a stadium and I show you this one film and we all chant and that's, we don't have a captive audience, which means that in order to reach these people who aren't evil, yes, there are a few bloodthirsty psychopaths, but for the large part, these are good people making bad decisions and maybe doing evil things as a result. I think we really need to connect to them and basically give them stuff they like. Let's give them credit for asking valid questions, and let's try to give them answers that will bring them back into the fold.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. She's at Yasmin D, Yasmind on Twitter. Rick Stengel.
I'm going to do the opposite of Emily. When I was a journalist, I didn't know much about what was going on and tried to make as much controversy as possible. And now I know a lot and try to make as little controversy as possible. That being said, I do think people, and I'm relatively new to government and will soon be out of government, but I think people should realize that what the USG does in fighting ISIL on the battlefield is enormous. What we've done in fighting them on the digital battlefield is also enormous. I mean, and the question of whether you're winning or not is less important than the fact that people are working on this 24/7. And I would just say that it is not a battle between government and violent extremism. It's really everybody's voice. Everybody has a role to play. I mean, the rise of disinformation and propaganda, everybody needs to contradict that and face off against that and stand up against that. And in every small way, that is the way that battle will ultimately be won.
Thank you, Rick. You can find him at Stengel on Twitter.
And I'll conclude by saying, I think we should, it's sort of a hopeful note. I think we should take away from this conversation that social media can be used in some pretty powerful ways for good. Mm-hmm. We tend to focus on how this very, very small percentage of our world population is trying to use the tools that we all know and love to abuse them and to exploit the community. That's a small population. But we know that terrorism existed, as we saw in the film at the beginning. We know that terrorism recruitment existed before the internet. And it's not a surprise that these groups are going to continue to try to use whatever technology is out there. But we see a much broader part of the population of society at large, as Rick says, that is standing against this. What we need to do is actually just help those voices reach others, get the message out there. And the final positive note is that incentives are really aligned here. From civil society groups to governments to tech companies, people do not want this content out there. Instead, people want to counter this with positive messages. And so I've got a lot of confidence about it.
All right, on that hopeful note.